Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. From cask to finish, the focus of my presentation this evening is very much going to be about these things. Now, does anyone know what these are? Oak trees, yeah. People usually say trees, but they are in fact oak trees. These ones here are very pretty, but they actually wouldn't be much use for making whiskey or wine because there's so many branches on them. And where you get branch points in the wood, of course, you get knots, and the knots are prone to leaking. And it reminds me, first little anecdote of the evening, that my former warehouse manager at Glen Morangie, who's long gone, I had to fire him because he became far too fond of the stuff. One day, our former Ardbeg distillery manager, who started off his life working in the warehouse at Glen Morangie, went into the warehouse and found a cask where a knot in the wood had come out and the whiskey was pouring out the cask. So he ran in a panic to get Johnny Urquhart, the head warehouseman, and Johnny said, "Calm down, son, I'll show you what to do." And he just went up to the barrel and went, and stood like that. So trees like that, no good. You need nice, tall, slender trees with the branches very high up. And you know, trees like that grow very well in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri, which is where we source our American white oak. So that's the first thing. It has to be tall, slender trunks with no branch points. A couple of pictures there, homing in on wood. I like this slide particularly, which is a close-up of this tree, because this is a very, very nice example of a trunk that has been cut. This is at one of the sawmills we use, and you can see the beautiful pattern of the annual growth rings in that. And that's what I'm homing in on when I go out to the Ozark Mountains, which I have to admit I don't do all the time. I'm actually in Scotland most of the time, actually making the whiskey. But these photos were taken on a trip, I think that was in 2008. As you can see at the bottom there, I had an absolutely shocking hangover that morning because we'd a bunch of journalists with us and we were up until all hours. I have got another anecdote about that, about my cowboy boots, but I'll maybe wait and see how much time we've got at the end. So, barrels, that's what we're going to be focusing on, because as far as I'm concerned, the wood makes the whiskey, and it doesn't matter how good your spirit is. If you put it into a poor quality barrel, then guess what? You'll end up with poor quality whiskey. So that's an ancient photo of Glen Morangie distillery. Hands up, have any of you in the room visited Glen Morangie? A few of you, good. You might not recognize that, but you'll recognize possibly this, a much more up-to-date picture. The distillery buildings themselves haven't changed that much. We have expanded production capacity several times. I've done it 3 times in the 18 years I've been with Glenmorangie. But it's a very traditional, it's very pretty distillery, as a lot of them are in Scotland. And it's almost like coming into a living, working museum. And I'll only automate the production process if there's a genuine product benefit to be had from it. So we are quite old-fashioned, hence our old advertising strapline, handcrafted by the 16 men of Tain. We can't use that anymore because there's now 27 men of Tain. Tain is the little town in the north of Scotland where the distillery is situated. Don't worry too much about the bullshit down the right-hand side there. This is a marketing department slide. But this is basically my team who are involved in the creation of the whiskies. There's myself. On the bottom right, Andy MacDonald is my distillery manager there. In the middle is a lady called Gillian MacDonald, who just joined me earlier on this year. She used to manage Penderyn Distillery, the Welsh whiskey distillery. But she, like myself, she's a chemist. So she's my head of analytics, and on the left, some bum, I'm not sure who that guy is. Yeah. No, but seriously, David doesn't just go round preaching the gospel about the whiskies. David actually does work with the team in terms of the development, and he's quite a creative guy, especially when it comes to handing in his expenses. But you know, he's very creative and comes up with some very good ideas. So that's the team. You know, In our view, we use the best quality wood in the Scotch whisky industry, and I am going to bore the pants off you for the next 10 minutes explaining why. But before we do that, I'll just say a little bit about the stills, because Glenmorangie, as I'm sure many of you know, is distilled in the tallest copper pot stills of any malt whisky distillery in Scotland. The total height of the stills is about 30 feet, but the key part here is the swan neck. And from the top of the boil pot up to the swan neck, 16 feet 10¼ inches high. And this has a very profound impact on the character of the whisky. It makes the spirit very delicate, very gentle. That's a photograph of the still house there, and in fact my next slide is an even better one. So it's a magnificent still house. Biased as I am, I do think it's the best in the Scotch whisky industry. It's almost like going into a cathedral, and in fact, on this side of the photo on the wall there, we've fitted a stained glass window to enhance this cathedral-like feel. There are 12 stills. On the right-hand side of the picture, with the sight glasses in there, is the wash stills for the first distillation, where we distill up the wash, or the beer, as you would call it here in the States. And then on the left is the spirit stills to further concentrate up the vapors and refine it. And because these necks are so tall, heavier, oilier alcohols and aldehydes and esters, all these volatile compounds, the heavier, longer chain ones, are just simply unable to quite reach the top, and they'll condense back out into liquid somewhere up the neck and fall down and be redistilled. So in some respects, it's maybe like we have a 2.5 times distillation, and the consequence of that is that our spirit is very delicate, it's very perfumed and very floral. So if I was to compare our stills with the stills at our good friends at Macallan, they've got very short, squat stills. Now, I'm not trying to stand up here and boast that ours is bigger than theirs, if you know what I mean. They're just different, and because they've got short, squat stills, they produce a very oily, very full-bodied spirit. A spirit which stands up very well to a full maturation in sherry casks, and that's very much the Macallan house style, whereas our delicate, more floral spirit would get completely swamped by the flavours of the sherry and the Spanish oak. So we prefer to use American white oak. So the size and shape of the copper pot still has a profound impact on the base spirit. However, once you've made your base spirit, if the quality of the wood is not good, then you won't get good whiskey. Because we believe that as much as 60%, maybe sometimes even more than that, of the flavour in the final whiskey either comes directly from the oak wood itself or from a combination of the oak wood and the residue of the sherry or wine or whatever that's been in it beforehand. So maturation is extremely important, and that's why we've invested many years of research and a lot of money into trying to develop the ideal cask type. How am I doing for time? Okay, 10 minutes in. Don't worry, folks, we're getting towards tasting the first whiskey real soon. Back in 1947, and we believe we were the first distillery in Scotland to do this, there are old records at Glenmorangie showing the receipt of a shipload of American oak ex-bourbon barrels, and we think we were the first company in Scotland to do this. And it's a beautiful synergy between the two countries, that to make Kentucky straight bourbon, again, as I'm sure you know, the spirit has to be matured in a new charred oak barrel and used only once. As Scots, we don't like to use a new barrel because it becomes too oaky. And again, our spirit, because of the way it's produced, is a bit different. Making bourbon whiskey, there's a lot of corn in there, which gives a very full-bodied spirit. So we prefer to use a barrel which has been used once previously for something else. So as soon as the distillers in Kentucky and Tennessee are finished, we try and buy them all up. I say try because we're finding increasing competition from the rum and tequila industries now, which of course is driving the price up. which is not good news for Scotsmen. We don't like that. Anyway, ex-bourbon barrels, which have been seasoned with American whiskey, taken some of the tannin out, are ideal, in my view, for a long, slow maturation of Scotch whiskey. And in fact, 90% of all whiskey distilled in Scotland today is matured in American white oak. However, we are not just content to pick up the phone to Wild Turkey or Jim Beam and buy the barrels. We actually have gone one step further and have developed our own specification for the barrels, and that's what I'm going to, I don't want to blind you with science, but I'm going to take about 10 minutes and take you through that process, and then we'll get to taste the first whiskey. The other thing I'd say here is that if you're filling your whiskey into 500-litre capacity sherry butts, that's what they call the casks from Spain, butts, B-U-T-T-S. Because of the surface area to volume ratio, you get less maturation from them. So again, a 200-litre capacity American barrel gives much more maturation potential. And I don't know, do we have any fans of Lafroig from Islay in here? Well, you know, they've taken that even one step further with their little quarter cask experiment, which gives more and very quick maturation. Sorry, what I'm going to do is we'll taste Glenmorangie Original in a minute, and then I'll tell you about the wood story. Most distillers in Scotland use their barrels many, many times, and there's nothing in the law to say how many times you use the cask. And in fact, some companies, I think, have this mission that as long as it was once part of a tree, it will do. But we are a lot more specific than that. And the more times you use the barrel, the less of the natural colour you get from it, and of course the less of the flavour. So for most of our whiskies, we only use the barrels 2 times, and then we'll sell it on to other people. It's a bit like, in the UK, we're a great nation of tea drinkers rather than coffee drinkers. You know, if you're making your tea with your tea leaves, you add your water for the first time, you get a nice rich brew, then you can maybe add a second quantity of water and still get a tasty brew. But after that, forget it. And it is the same for barrels. So we only use our cask twice. And you may have seen that in some of our adverts going about the place. Okay, let's taste the first whiskey, which is the Glenmorangie Original. Obviously, in my job, I can drink any whiskey in our range, and in fact, I could even take a bath in Glenmorangie 25-year-old if I really wanted to. But my favourite is the original because I think it is the purest and most delicate expression of Glenmorangie. It's a whiskey you can drink any time. You can have it with your breakfast if you want. You can have it as an aperitif. You know, it's an anytime, anywhere whiskey. And this may shock some of you here, but one of my new favourite way of drinking original, and it certainly raised the eyebrow of our president of our company when he saw me doing this, is to have a tumbler, a couple of rocks of ice, a big measure of Glenmorangie Original, a bit of ginger ale, and then a squeeze of fresh lime juice. And trust me, it's absolutely beautiful and very, very refreshing. However, we're not going to do that here this evening. We're going to taste it in its raw, natural form. So it's a delicate pale gold colour. Of course, I could darken the colour down if I chose to add a bit of spirit caramel to that, but personally I think that's a bit dishonest, so I don't like doing that. So please don't let the colour of a whiskey fool you. It is most definitely not an indicator of quality. It might mean it's a very old whiskey. More than likely it means it's had lots of caramel added. It's all about the taste and the bouquet. So, on the nose, you get all this nice delicate citrus fruit like lemon or mandarin orange. You get a hint of that nice sweet creamy vanilla. Maybe a little bit of spice in there. So let's try a little sip. And it's sweet, and it's got that nice, sweet, creamy vanilla or white chocolate in there. But it's very, very soft and gentle on the palate. Now, you've got jugs of water. I see some of you've got bottles in. The jugs are actually a little bit cold for this, but how many of you drink your whiskey straight up? A lot of you. How many of you drink it on the rocks? Okay. I mean, I drink it all sorts of ways. It just depends what whiskey or where I am. But the favourite way in Scotland is just to add a few drops of water, like this. Not too many. You can tell from the big measures that I actually poured my own measures at the start of this class. So once you've added the water and mix it through it, when you inhale the bouquet again, it's changed quite a lot and it's opened the whiskey up. It's brought a lot more of these floral and aromatic top notes out. And we refer to this phenomenon as releasing the serpent, because the bouquet rises up out the glass like a snake or serpent. Now, of course, if you have it on the rocks, the ice has the opposite effect. And it closes the bouquet down. And I often draw a comparison to when a gentleman is going for a swim and the swimming pool is particularly cold. What happens? The serpent disappears, and it's the same. It is the same with whiskey, although it does accentuate the basal flavours. So if I'm drinking Glenmorangie Astar, for example, I quite often have that with 1 or 2 rocks of ice, and it brings out even more of that nice oaky basal flavour. So try again. If you've added some water, try another sip. You've got these strange things on the table. I don't know what these are. We don't recognise these in Scotland. But it's got a nice, soft, creamy texture, some nice sweet vanilla, hints of peaches or apricots, a little bit of delicate citrus fruit, and in the aftertaste, this nice, gentle suggestion of almond or coconut or something like that. So a very delicious range of flavour. This slide is a little bit out of date because Glenmorangie Original has won the gold medal and best in class in 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. I do sit on the IWSC judging panel, but so does the rest of my peer group in the industry. So it's won many awards. Anyway, okay, this is some other pictures, 1 or 2 quotes from John Hansel there. We've done a lot of research work over many, many years to try and develop the ideal specification for our barrels. So this is me with a couple of the lumberjacks out in Missouri. He's just cut the tree down. That's quite a thin one there. You won't get much from that, but we're just looking at the pattern of the annual growth rings, because that's going to give us a clue as to whether or not it will suit our barrels. So, a very fully mature oak tree will often take up to 150 years. And it seems a bit of a shame that we come along and cut it down. But I can assure you that it's done in a very, very sustainable manner. And in fact, the last time I was out in the Missouri for the tree felling, the Missouri Conservation Department turned up en masse. And they had a very nice young lady manager. And I managed to persuade her to take her clothes. I managed to persuade her to appear in our film, and she was saying that when we come out and do these operations, for every 1 oak tree that's felled, as many as 50 acorns will seed themselves back in the ground, and they have to come in and thin the forest out again. And I've just been working with the Scotch Whisky Association, our governing body, on a sort of working group into sustainability. And the coopering industry in the United States uses less than 1% of the total oak trees that are felled here. So, we like to think that we are very environmentally friendly, and we don't just come in and indiscriminately blitz the forest. We are cherry picking the right trees for the job. So as I say, to get to a very thick, mature tree, sometimes it can take up to 150 years. I'm just going to flick through that slide. It's fairly irrelevant. Again, this was taken at the sawmill. I think the sawmill was in Tennessee. So the tree has been cut down, it's been cut into staves. And this is looking at the end of one of the staves. So that's about this size you're looking at there. And again, you can see how close the annual growth rings are together. And that's basically what I'm looking for. I'm looking for so-called tight-grained oak. And in fact, in one of my presentations, I've got a very sad picture of me down at the trunk of the tree with my little 6-inch ruler, counting the number of growth rings, because I'm looking for between 12 and 16 growth rings per inch. Any less than that, then it's an indication that the tree is a fast-growing tree. Any more than that, and the wood becomes too brittle and you can't work with it. So 12 to 16 growth rings per inch. Now, trust me, you're going to like this little bit. Again, another 5 or 10 minutes here. That's me working with our forester there. That's obviously a very, very mature tree. I think that was about 160 years old. That was on a previous trip to the Ozark Mountains many years ago. You can see that I was just a little boy in that picture there. So this is taken from one of my textbooks. Again, a cross-section of the tree trunk, and the growth rings exist in two phases in the wood. In the springtime, once the tree kind of wakes up from its little hibernation, it bursts into a spurt of growth, and that type of wood is known as early wood. And the early wood is represented by the thin band there, or the dark band there. Then once the tree fully wakes up, once the weather improves and it really starts growing, it lays down the majority of the woody material, and this is known as late wood. So the absolute quantity of late wood is always more than the early wood. But if your tree is a very slow-growing tree, if it's growing on north-facing slopes where it doesn't get as much sunlight, if there's not so much moisture and nutrients, the total amount of the late wood is less and the growth rings appear closer together. And when the growth rings are closer together like that, you have, relatively speaking, a higher quantity of the early wood, which is why I want 12 to 16 growth rings per inch. And I'm very gratified to see that no one has yet fallen asleep here. The reason why I want to maximize the early wood is because of this. This is my favorite slide in the whole presentation. It's a scanning electron micrograph, which is a photograph taken down a microscope of the junction between the late wood and the early wood. And as you can clearly see, the early wood is very much more open and spongy, whereas the late wood is very hard and very dense. And if you think what I'm saying to you here is something that I invented in a dream one night, this research has been backed up by the American bourbon industry and in particular the wine industry. So the next time you go and buy a bottle of Screaming Eagle or a bottle of Chateau Lafite in your friendly neighborhood wine store, you can bet your bottom dollar that the winemaker will also have used tight-grained, slow-growth wood. Because when you have more of this open, porous, early wood, and you cut through it into the staves, and then fill your wine or whiskey in, your liquid simply comes in contact with a much greater surface area, and therefore takes more of these lovely flavors out of the oak wood. And, you know, don't get me wrong here, between using our barrels and other barrels, I'm not talking a black and white difference, it's shades of grey, but we believe that it just does give our whiskey that extra little bit of flavour. So, the next thing that happens is, once the trees have been selected, once I've got my little ruler out, once I'm satisfied that they've got between 12 and 16 rings per inch, it goes to the sawmill where it's cut down into staves. Now normally the wood is then just thrown into an oven and dried and made into barrels. And I'm hearing horror stories that it's barely taking 8 weeks from the first cut of the tree to the first filling of whiskey. And you know, the wood is far too green and far too immature, and it will give bitter, resinous flavours. So our wood is stacked like that in bundles 20 feet high, and it's allowed to season or mature naturally in the open air for a minimum of 2 years, usually 3 years. And you can see the light coloured, that's the new wood there. The darker wood is wood that's been in the open air for a long time. And during this phase, the tannin, the hemicellulose, all these things that give the tannic acid, that give astringency, they're broken down by microbial action and flushed out of the wood. So again, a top winemaker would always insist on having air-seasoned wood. And this is just some experimental work I did many, many years ago. It's pretty boring, really, but it's just to try and show you that the range of flavours from air-seasoned wood is much nicer. Oaky, sweet, vanilla, toasty, whereas with kiln-dried, it's spicy, it's woody, it's green, it's acrid. So there's just a better range of flavour from air-seasoned wood. The wood is then sent to Bluegrass Cooperage in Louisville in Kentucky, where it's manufactured into 200-litre capacity barrels. The standard practice for bourbon barrels is to give them a very heavy char, usually a grade 4 or a grade 5, sometimes called an alligator char, because the charcoal layer inside the barrel looks like the scales of an alligator's back. But what we do is we have our barrels toasted, which uses heat rather than naked flame. And you know what it's like if you're toasting yourself a bagel for your breakfast and you burn it and it goes black. It doesn't taste very good, but if you gently toast it till it's golden brown, then it's much nicer. And it's the same for oak wood. Again, wine barrels will be toasted rather than charred. So our barrels are toasted, and then they're given a quick 30-second char, because we do want some charcoal layer and a bit of colour in there. So the whole specification of our barrels, which is slow growth, air seasoned, heavily toasted, lightly charred American white oak ex-bourbon barrels, is quite unique in the whiskey industry. And to me, more than anything else, they are the secret that gives Glenmorangie its lovely flavour. Now, 100% of my barrels are not made to this specification, but they do form the heart of the recipe for Glenmorangie Original. And as time goes on, I'm putting more and more money into these, so the numbers are increasing. And that's one of the great benefits of our company being bought in 2004 by LVMH, Moet Hennessy, Louis Vuitton. It means that I've just had so much more money to spend on developing the whiskies. But I do bottle a small amount entirely from these barrels. So at long last, and as a reward for your patience, we're going to taste whiskey number 2, which is on the bottom left of your mat. It's the Glenmorangie Astar. I think this is the quintessence of everything Glenmorangie should be. To me, it is one of the most perfect Glenmorangies in the range. I've decided to bottle this at natural cask strength. So this weighs in at a whopping 57.1% alcohol. So you may want to cut it. If you inhale the bouquet at full strength, you know, it's quite pungent with the alcohol, but you get some of the kind of mint-flavoured toffee, a hint of eucalyptus, something like that. I am certainly going to release my serpent. I just added a little bit more water this time. And it's just, again, it's opened it up so beautifully, and I'm getting all sorts of citrus fruit in there now. A hint of, you know, pencil shaving or carpenter's workshop. Again, this lovely mintiness. So let's try a sip. It's big, it's spicier on the palate, although that's primarily to do with the higher alcohol. But it's very big, very mouth-filling, and once you get over the tingle of the alcohol, you get all this lovely vanilla, you get creme brulee, you get hints of almond marzipan, maybe some tropical fruit in there, a little bit of star anise in the aftertaste. But again, I just think it's such a lovely range of flavours. And it's quite, in spite of its strength, it's quite easy to drink until you realise you've drunk too much of it and fall over. So that's whiskey number 2. And I often think of Astar as being like the original on steroids. It's just a similar range of flavours, but it's bigger, it's juicier, it's richer, it's more intense. The original's bottled at 43%, but we bottle Astar at pretty much its natural cask strength. So after it's been matured for the 10 or 11 years it's aged, the strength has gone down. We fill the spirit into the barrels at 63.5% alcohol, and it loses a certain amount over the 10 years, and it ends up being round about 57 or 58. Astar, yes, good question. Scottish Gaelic word meaning journey, and it's to try and talk about the journey from the acorn through the tree, through all the stages of the process. Now, I mentioned our friends at Macallan earlier and what success they have maturing their spirit in sherry casks. I don't like to do that for Glenmorangie because the flavour of the sherry or the other wines becomes too dominant. So I take the same recipe of first fill and second fill casks, essentially for Glenmorangie original, and after 10 years I will then transfer it or re-rack it into another barrel to allow it to finish or extra mature. So I want it to take a little bit of the character of the secondary oak or the wine or what's ever been in there, but most importantly I want it to try and maintain its unique DNA, the thing that makes it Glenmorangie. So we invented this concept of finishing, as we used to call it, a number of years ago, and now it's much imitated throughout the industry. And I'm quite intrigued to see that a lot of the American distillers are also now looking at finishing to try and slightly change the character of the product. So we've got 3 members of the extra matured range. If I use ruby port pipes from Oporto in Portugal, we get what I call the Quinta Ruban. If I use Spanish oak sherry casks from Jerez de la Frontera in Spain, we have the La Santa. And if I use French oak Sauterne casks from the Sauterne Appellation in Bordeaux, we end up with Nectar d'Or. So we've got samples of La Santa and Nectar d'Or for you to try now. We also have the Quinta Ruban at the Glenmorangie stand if you want to try that one. So another very, very old picture taken at Glenmorangie. The fields in the background there are now completely covered in maturation warehouses, but it shows you some Spanish oak sherry casks being delivered to Glenmorangie Distillery by horse and cart. So that was probably taken in about the 1980s, and no, maybe the 1890s, something like that. But it was just to show you that although I said earlier that we were the first company to use bourbon barrels, if you go way back, Spanish oak sherry casks were used by most distillers in Scotland. And I think the end result of that would be that the whiskies would have tasted a lot more like each other than they do now. They're a lot more distinctive now. And you have to be careful if you use a sherry cask. In La Santa, for example, and it's difficult to say exactly, but I estimate that about 25% of the flavour comes from the raw spirit, about 40% comes from the maturation in the ex-bourbon barrel, and even although it's only been in the sherry cask 2 years, a whopping 35% of the character of La Santa comes from the maturation in sherry casks. That's a picture of one of my team, Annabelle. What she's doing there is sniffing someone's butt. Ho, ho, ho. That's just to let you see what a Spanish oak sherry butt looks like. They're very big 500-litre capacity casks. There are many different styles of sherry wine, as I'm sure lots of you know, but the one we tend to use in Scotland is called Dry Oloroso, which is kind of medium sweet in style, and that in fact is the type of casks I have used for Glenmorangie La Santa. So, in the middle of your top row is whiskey number 3, Glenmorangie La Santa. It has a lovely kind of walnutty brown colour. This is bottled at 46% alcohol by volume, and like the Astar, it is non-chill filtered. Does everyone know what I mean by that? No? Right. Most whiskies, prior to bottling, are reduced the bottling strength. They are then chilled down to round about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, and this brings the oil or lipid, lipid is basically this stuff, the fat, out of solution, and it's filtered out of the whiskey to maintain a bright appearance in the bottle. But more and more whiskey consumers are now asking that we don't do that, because when you do that, you remove a little bit of the flavour, you remove a lot of the texture. So a number of the Glenmorangie whiskies, and indeed many other whiskies bottled throughout Scotland, are now being offered in their natural, non-chill filtered form. Once the strength drops below 45.5% alcohol by volume, these oils can come out of solution. So that's why most non-chill filtered whiskey is bottled at a higher strength. And if you were to take your glass and put a cube of ice in it, or maybe even when we add water, it sometimes goes slightly opaque or cloudy. That's not a sign of a fault in the whiskey, that's just some of this lovely natural goodness coming out of solution. So the extra matured range, Astar and Signet in the Glenmorangie range are all non-chill filtered. In fact, I was up working in Boston 2 years ago, and I went over to Boston in January. Nobody told me how cold it gets there. And the gentleman I was working with had left his case of Glenmorangie samples in the back of his car overnight, and we went to get them in the morning. Even the original, which is chill filtered, it was like a layer of ice cream sitting on top of it with all these oils coming out of solution. And once we kind of warmed the bottles up in the palm of our sweaty hands and shook them, the oils just went back into solution. So, Glenmorangie La Santa, much spicier, richer bouquet. I mean, there's lots of cinnamon or ginger or dried fruits like raisins or dates. If we have any cigar smokers in here, if you're going to pair a Glenmorangie whiskey with a cigar, La Santa or Signet or Quinta Ruban, I would suggest, rather than the original or the Astar, because they're just richer and more intense. I've just released my Serpent again. And it's brought lots of these classic sherry notes out, a hint of aged balsamic vinegar, some demerara sugar, some plump, juicy raisins, cinnamon, ginger, clove. If you haven't already done so, let's try a sip now. And it's got that almost, stickiness in the palate. The original and the Astar had this creaminess to it, but this is almost, sometimes if you're opening a tin of peaches and there's the peach juice, it's that kind of stickiness in there. Very classic of whiskies which have been matured in sherry casks. And of course, I've accentuated that stickiness or that oiliness by having the whiskey non-chill filtered. It's rich, it's spicy. You get all that range of spices. You get a different type of nuttiness. Remember with original, I suggested almond and coconut. With this, it's much more like walnut or hazelnut or something like that. And I don't know, for some reason, when I drink La Santa, it always makes me think of Christmas. This kind of Christmas cake, Christmas spiciness. So, that's whiskey number 3, made by taking original and extra maturing it for 2 years in Spanish oak sherry casks. We're really picking the pace up now, so straight on to whiskey number 4, which is made in exactly the same way as La Santa, except for the final 2 years I use French oak Sauterne casks. Now, are any of you familiar with a Glenmorangie whiskey I launched last year called 1981 Pride? Nope. Do any of you have a bottle? I'm not too surprised. I've got one because it costs more than $3,500 a bottle, and it's very, very rare whiskey. But it started off as an experiment I tried way back in the mid-1990s, and I bought a small parcel of casks from the famous Chateau d'Yquem in Sauterne, which is, for those of you who know Sauterne wine, is the ultimate wine from that region. And I always felt the style of flavours in Sauterne wine and Glenmorangie would be very nicely paired. So I kept this in these barrels for many, many years, and last year bottled the tiny quantity that was left as 1981 Pride. But the main result of that experiment is this. That's really what I was trying to do to see if I could make a mainstream offering. So whiskey number 4 on the top right, Glenmorangie Nectar d'Or, is as a result of this experiment. Some of the casks in the blend occasionally come from Yquem, but I'm filling about 1,200 barriques each year, so I can't possibly get them all from Chateau d'Yquem. Now, this is what I would call a closed whiskey, and by that I mean it doesn't give up its character easily. It's quite a shy whiskey, so you may want to caress the glass on the palm of your sweaty hand and just warm it up a little bit, relax it a little bit, and encourage its personality to come out. Again, if you want to do so, a little splash of water may just encourage some more of this character to come out. Certainly, the whiskey is quite cold in the glass here, but once it opens up, you know, when I smell this whiskey, I imagine myself to be in Paris in one of the fabulous bakeries or patisseries there, and I can get all the aroma of, you know, croissant, of brioche, of pain au raisin, all these nice smells you get in there. Maybe a hint of lemon meringue pie, some vanilla or white chocolate. Yeah, it's really starting to open up now. I'm getting lots of nice coconut. It sometimes makes me think of a pineapple-flavoured sponge cake covered in desiccated coconut. I know I'm maybe getting a bit carried away here, but it's that sort of aroma and flavour you get from the whiskey. Okay, let's try a big sip. This has changed so much in just the few minutes that I've been rambling on here, just because I've warmed it up a little bit and put some water into it. And it's quite unusual, this. It's got a combination of intense sweetness, but it's also got a lot of spiciness. And the spiciness comes from the French oak, which is far higher level of tannin than American oak. And in fact, if I over-age this product in French oak for too long, sometimes the French oak can tend to dominate and make it appear a bit astringent. So I'm the first to hold my hand up and admit that Nectar d'Or is a bit variable, but you get what I'm trying to do here. Bring out lots of these sumptuous dessert-like flavours and balance it with some of the intensity from the French oak. So if you're interested, of the 3 extra matured whiskies, Nectar d'Or's biggest market is here in the United States. So thank you folks for that. Please keep drinking it. Okay, unfortunately we're getting now towards the end of the presentation. That's the bad news. But the good news is we're going to taste one of the whiskies from what we call the Glenmorangie Prestige range, which consists of 18-year-old, which is very much the big brother of original in style. It consists of the mighty 25-year-old, which is made in very small quantities and sells for a fairly high price, but it also includes a whiskey which in many respects is my magnum opus, which is the whiskey that eventually, after 26 years of working with the idea and trying different things, ended up being bottled as Glenmorangie's Signet. So that's what we're going to try here. Now, if I go way back to my university days, my best pal and I, as a lot of students have, you know, we had ideas way above our station, and we fancied ourselves as being dandies and playboys and tried to drink fine wine. We used to drink Jamaica Blue Mountain coffee, which is my favorite coffee. And one of the reason why we first tasted this is that in the James Bond books, that's what James Bond drinks, Jamaica Blue Mountain. So we were bloody well going to drink it as well. But once we get into the coffee, I became interested in the way in which the roasting of the beans could bring out different characteristics and different flavors. And at that same time, I also discovered malt whiskey for the first time. So I merged the two loves together and thought it'd be fun to try and make a whiskey in which the malted barley had been roasted in a drum like coffee beans. So fast forward to 1995, when I became distillery manager at Glenmorangie, I made some secret batches of whiskey using a material which is known as high roast chocolate malt. And this is malted barley that's been roasted in a drum. It's normally used, this product, for making stout or porter. So I started making batches of whiskey with it. But maybe about 12 years later, when I went back to taste it, it was just far too intense, far too full on. So I then spent another 2 or 3 years playing around with different recipes until I got something that worked. So the heart of the recipe in this is made with whiskey from the high roast chocolate malt. There is also some classic Glenmorangie made using our own cadball barley, which we grow on our farm beside the distillery. I don't actually know why that's got 85%. That's not right. Please just, these percentages are not right there. I'm not sure where that came from. Anyway, the cadball barley malt is grown by ourselves. It is all matured in these slow growth, air seasoned, heavily toasted, lightly charred American white oak ex-bourbon barrels. So a very, very creamy style of Glenmorangie. I use some Glenmorangie whiskies matured in Spanish oak sherry casks. I use some which have actually been matured in virgin oak barrels. There are 2 or 3 secret Glenmorangies in there. And finally, there's a top dressing of our oldest and rarest whiskies, 35 through to 40-year-old. So it's a horribly complicated recipe. And once I put it all together, the mix is then filled back into refill barrels to allow it all to marry or knit together for 6 months before it's bottled. And you know, consumers have quite rightly said to me they find batch-to-batch variations in Signet, and that will continue to be the case. Sometimes the batches are only outstanding, and the rest of the time they're much better than that. So let's put this to the test now and try a taste of Glenmorangie's Signet. It's a lovely dark colour. The dark colour does not come from the chocolate malt because, of course, the spirit when it's distilled is all clear. This comes from the sherry casks and the virgin oak casks. Now, this is quite different from the other whiskies we've tried this evening. It's much deeper, it's much nuttier. You may even already be starting to get the hints of the mocha, the coffee, the chocolate. So once again, a little splash of water. We'll just open it out. And maybe now hints of almond biscotti or tiramisu, some nice tangy, bittersweet Seville orange in there. So hopefully that's whetted your appetite now to take a sip. Let's try it. Now this is very big, very bold, very rich, very, very intense whiskey. Lots of nice, dark, high cocoa solid chocolate in there. Some nice simmering espresso coffee. Hints of sugar, bits of almond biscotti, tangy citrus fruit. There's an awful lot going on in this glass. And for what this is worth, folks, normally when I drink my Signet, I have it in a tumbler with 1 or 2 very large rocks of ice in it. And the ice actually seems to accentuate that lovely, voluptuous mouthfeel. So, I've got the signal from the back of the room there that I'm about to be hooked off stage. Just out of curiosity. Right. Right, right. Okay, thank you. Just out of curiosity, hands up those of you whose favourite whiskey was number 1, the original. Yep, a couple of us. Number 2, the Astar. Number 3, La Santa. Number 4, Nectar d'Or. And finally, number 5, Signet. I'm sure some of you must have put your hands up twice there. You can see how by changing the barrel in particular, you can change the flavours that you get in your final whiskey. So, much against the advice I was given by my colleague David earlier, I'll just tell you one final little story. And I was actually reminded of this from the lady who's currently delivering the Diageo Masterclass, because she attended a seminar I conducted in this area for the distributor a number of years ago. And when I told this story, there was actually a number of written complaints went into the president of Moet Hennessy USA. A couple of years later, somebody said, "What happened to that guy that told the story?" They asked David it, and they said, "Did he get fired?" And David said, "No, he got promoted." So anyway, it's just building on something I said earlier. Our company was bought by LVMH, Moet Hennessy Louis Vuitton, back at the end of 2004. And things have changed quite a lot in terms of the fact that I've had a lot more money to invest in the distillery, in developing new products, and buying even more of these barrels. So it's all been good news. But in common with a lot of other corporations, the senior management have certain objectives to achieve each year. We have performance-related pay. And if at the end of the year we have achieved very well against our objectives, we get paid a bonus. So the question I have for you is, what's the difference between a bonus and a penis? Right. Right. The answer to the question is, your wife sure knows how to blow a bonus. So ladies and gentlemen, right, on that bombshell, thank you all very much for coming along this evening. Right.